Good afternoon, and the first step is to apologize to you all for being American. So, we're talking about reframing borderline personality through the lens of evolution and neuroscience. So, 30 years ago, a family member began behaving erratically and disappeared, was estranged. And our family had no idea what had happened. It was like a tornado blew through everything. We didn't know what to do. And the word borderline was kind of mumbled around, and we didn't know what it meant. So we decided to look for an expert. Now, this family member was 17 years old. So we found an expert in New York City who was renowned for studying borderline personality disorder. He listened to our story, and he gave the following advice. Stop giving him money, mourn him, and go on with your life. I was flabbergasted. I was shocked. That was the best advice an expert could give. That was what science had to offer. That was unacceptable. So I have a science background and a lot of instincts, and I decided that that would not do. I had to learn more about this disorder. So we organized an organization, Tara, for borderline personality disorder. And any of you who know about Buddhism, Tara is the Buddhist goddess of compassion, which I thought was an appropriate name for a mental illness that needs a lot of compassion. So we formed this organization. The first thing we did was we found this woman, Marsha Linehan, who had developed the first evidence-based treatment for borderline personality disorder called dialectic behavior therapy, DBT. And we organized the first conference on DBT in New York City in 1994. The second thing I did was I called Ronald Kessler. And Ronald Kessler was the developer of the National Comorbidity Survey Replication. That was a survey that counted all the mentally ill people in the United States and told you how many there were of each disorder. Of course, borderline had been left out of that study for years. So after talking with him, it was included. So now we had support groups, and we had a referral directory. We started grassroots research. So we ran surveys on immune disorders, sensitivity, on shame, on autism, relationship to autism, and so on. We were collecting data because we knew how important data is to all of you. If you don't have data, it doesn't exist. And we ran support groups. So over 30 years, I've spoken to thousands of family members of people who have supposedly borderline personality disorder. It's very difficult to diagnose, so most people diagnose their loved ones themselves. Well, they all told their stories. Now, I've given talks in Russia, in Argentina, all over the United States, all over Europe. Something was wrong. All these people were telling me the same exact thing. They were different by culture, by job, by age, by occupation, by religion, and their loved ones were all saying the same thing. It didn't make any sense. They would say things like, "You never listen to me. You don't understand me. You're never there for me. You've betrayed me. Where did that come from? You never stand up for me." And then their behavior didn't make any sense. They would get upset over benign things that nobody else would notice or even think about. So I made this diagram many years ago about how people with BPD feel. So they're like in a bubble, and they feel alone, isolated, unheard, criticized, rejected, misunderstood, judged, invisible, disconnected. And I listened to your speaker before, And he was talking about the experience in prison, and prison is isolation and lack of social connection. So these people just feel alone all the time. Why was that? So I started to go to many neuroscience conferences and psychology conferences. And I'm a New Yorker. I go right up to people and either publicly or privately, I ask questions. Why isn't borderline included in your studies? Why do you say such negative, stigmatizing things about borderline? Why do you keep blaming the parents? Sometimes I got good answers, and sometimes they ran when they saw me, but that was okay. So we went on and we looked at what were the characteristics that we saw in these people. They were super sensitive, starting at early childhood. They misunderstood what people said and got upset over nothing. They they all said the same thing and complained about the same thing. I could not understand. There had to be a reason for that. Nature doesn't do things for no reason at all. There had to be a reason. So I collected all the neuroscience studies on borderline that I could. And then I wondered, where did the name borderline come from? Well, in case you don't know, it came from a man named Adolf Stern. He was a psychoanalyst in New York City in 1938. That was almost 90 years ago. And as a psychoanalyst, he said, I have these patients, and they are not psychotic, they are not neurotic, they're not psychotic, they're not delusional, and they're not cognitively challenged. But my treatment doesn't work on them. Now, for a psychiatrist to tell you his treatment doesn't work, that's already a step ahead. But he said his treatment didn't work. So he did not know why. So he began a whole list of the characteristics he saw in borderline personality disorder. He said that they were hypervigilant, that they were hypersensitive, that they were shame-prone, that they were constitutionally negative, that they always saw themselves as victims. And all of these descriptions is what I was hearing from the families and from the helpline and from all the experiences I had. In 1980, the American Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, if you're familiar with that, it's a list of all the mental disorders with their symptoms, came out and included borderline personality disorder. Their list of symptoms did not match my experience, did not match Adolf Stern, and did not match anything I heard from the borderline people. It just didn't make any sense. The other thing that happened is, what were the families like? The families were all of a kind. The characteristic of the families was defeat and despair and frustration. They loved these people very, very much, but they felt they had failed as parents or as partners or as siblings because they couldn't help these people. And they kept getting into these fights and arguments with them. So they felt that they failed as parents. They failed to fix the problem. People's general approach to a problem is to fix it. This was not a problem to fix. It was a problem to accept, but they didn't know that. So they couldn't fix it. They couldn't repair it. The relationships were falling apart, and they were in despair. The worst was older parents who looked at the situation and said, what will happen to my loved one when I'm dead and there's no one left to take care of them? That was the situation I have been dealing with almost no change for 30 years. That is not acceptable. So I figured there had to be some other place to look for an explanation for all of this. and thinking that nature doesn't make mistakes like science does. You know, science, when they don't know what to do, they guess. There are a lot of mistakes in science. So, in the mental health field, one of the first ways was drilling a hole in somebody's head to let out the mental illness evil spirits. Another one was, do you know about lobotomies? They would take a needle, stick it in somebody's eye, and get it all the way into your head, into the thalamus, and it was supposed to cure impulsivity. And what did they do with homosexuality? Oh, well, they gave you electric shock. That was supposed to cure homosexuality. So science makes lots and lots of mistakes. And borderline personality disorder became the inheritor of this trend because borderline personality disorder was supposed to be caused by the family. And that crippled the family. I think that's why there isn't any very strong advocacy for personality disorders, because the families are beaten down. So on my journey, I was studying psychedelics, and somebody referenced a man who studied evolution. And I started to study evolutionary psychiatry. And that brought me to the caveman. And when I started studying the caveman, things began to fall into place. So what do we know about the caveman? By the way, this slide on apparent competence, when a family member would tell somebody about their child who had BPD and was raging and doing all these upsetting things, the person would look at them, and we call it the raised eyebrow, because the person with BPD can turn off this negative behavior with strangers, but with people that they're close to, it's like they're a different person. We call it apparent competence, and it was called the raised eyebrow effect. So we found out in evolution that what was the purpose of the caveman? Well, the first thing he had to do was to stay alive. The second thing he had to do was survive and procreate, reproduce, and he had to connect with others, and he had to predict what was going to go on so he could continue to survive. A lot of these became automatic responses like the limbic system. So if you were a caveman and lived here, what abilities would you need to survive? So think about it. You're running around in the jungle, you're running around in the desert, in a forest. What are you at risk for? Well, first of all, an animal can come up, a lion, a tiger, a coyote, and they could attack you. How would you defend yourself? Well, what was your defense? Your defense would be to be aware if they were coming, to be vigilant, to be aware of danger. And slowly, the people, the cavemen, who were the most sensitive to danger, survived. And it's called hypervigilance. That's ceaselessly, incessantly scanning the environment for danger. Well, lo and behold, what do you think the borderline people say to their family? I'm never safe here. It's not safe here. I don't feel safe with you. I'm very interested in linguistics. Why do they say safe? What is that feeling? And what does it have to do with the caveman? The caveman was also super sensitive to sensory experiences, such as smell. Well, if you're walking through the forest and you see a fruit or a fruit on the floor, do you eat it or do you not eat it? How do you know if it's rotten or if it's good or if it's not good? Those with the most sensitive sensory abilities were able to survive because they could figure out what was safe and what was not. So slowly I began to see that the caveman developed traits that were very important for our lives and very often are overlooked. It turned out that the caveman, in order to survive, was not walking around by himself. Then he was a goner. So they began to walk around in little groups, and the groups would be 10, 15, max 20 people. And that is the origin of what we call families, because that little group went together, supported one another, shared responsibilities, went out and slayed the big animals together, divided up the big animal that they got so that they could share it with the group. And you can see here, the first thing they had to do was to develop hypervigilance. And you can see our cavemen are already, you can see the stance. They're in high threat protection system. They're looking for danger. And then they evolved a threat protection system. Those of you who study neuroscience, I think it's the default mode network that we're talking about. And this hypersensitivity was to light, was to smell, to sound, to touch, to oral, what they could eat. So if we look at this slide, social behavior is necessary for survival. So you can see one person is there kind of working on some clothing. These men are working together. The men are coming in, they're dragging in an animal they've just killed. And you can see it's a community where people are sharing different jobs. And so social connection became one of the primary things that a caveman needed to survive. In preparing for this talk, I read lots of books on social connection, and I found out that there are more brain circuits in every part of the brain for social connection than for anything else. That's how important it is. And think about what's the worst thing we can do to a prisoner? We put him in solitary confinement so he has no connection with anybody else. So our social connection was used to help women give birth to babies, and also to raise the babies, to keep them alive. We shared jobs as cavemen. Oxytocin developed, which will be called the love hormone, but which is the hormone, the brain transmitter, that opens up the birth canal when a woman is giving birth, which starts lactation, and which comes up after you have sex so that you're in love with the person you just had sex with. It's called the love hormone. All of this developed with the caveman. All of these things are deficits in people with borderline personality disorder. So here you see them sharing, killing an animal. I went and looked at every bit of research I had collected over 30 years. And each one of these boxes is a trait that has evidence, research studies done to show that these qualities exist. And what are they? Hypervigilance, hypersensitivity, anxiety, problems connecting their feelings with their body and naming them, focusing on the self, mistrust, not experiencing positive feelings. So what Adolf Stern said is what the caveman said and is what this research said. But nobody was looking at it that way. All they were doing was telling us that these people were manipulating, looking for attention, and I'm sure if you know anything about borderline personality disorder, that's what you've heard. None of it is accurate. The people who have borderline are incredibly stigmatized. So this is a picture of the modern world. So that's a picture of New York City, if you haven't been there. What do you need to live here? Do you need the same qualities that you need if you are a person with borderline personality disorder? So what the caveman needed is not what you need in today's world. This world is too much for most of you, and for the borderline person, it is overwhelming. It is too much stress, too much stimuli. They can't process it. And for evolution to get our brain ready to live in this world is going to take a couple of 100 years. So what happens to people with this level of stress in their lives? Well, some people can turn it off. My prediction is that in 10 or 20 years, people with Asperger-like symptoms or traits are going to be the people who do the best survival because they can cut out all this noise and focus. And they're not involved with emotion the way the caveman was, because emotion was how they were connecting. Psychedelics for me was an amazing thing because psychedelics actually changes the brain. And I felt that that was where maybe there was an answer. Unfortunately, with the current climate, I don't know what's going to happen to all of that research. The major thing is we have forgotten how to connect with one another. How do we connect? How did we learn to connect? We learned to listen to people. We learned to read faces. We learned to mentalize, to be able to think about how the other person sees the situation. We learned to have empathy and compassion. And nowadays, people do not know how to listen to one another, especially since, how many of you have your cell phone with you? How many of you have a computer or a what do you call them? A platform, in your purse or your bag? So in the United States, we have right now an epidemic of loneliness. We have an epidemic of loneliness that is making an enormous rate of suicide amongst youngsters, amongst teens, young people. And so I put all of this together, and why are these young people committing suicide? Because they're so isolated. When COVID came, everybody was wearing a mask. Well, how do you read faces when everybody's wearing a mask? It's kind of scary. People were forced to stay home and kind of locked in their house. And what did they do? They went on their devices. And, of course, social media. So if you're a kid and you go to school and somebody doesn't like your dress, or you didn't get a 95 on an exam, you go home and you sit in your little corner and you deal with it. But now with social media, it's on social media, and 50 kids are telling you that you failed, or 30 kids are telling you that you didn't look nice, and then it goes viral, and suddenly the whole world is criticizing you. That is devastating for these youngsters. So they are not learning to connect with their family. They're not learning to connect with their peers. And this is social isolation. The other thing that I learned is the development of family. That original small band that was running around the forest together was the primary family. Now, all of you, I've spoken to a few students here, you're studying genes. So you study genes and you want to know about the family. And when we start our classes, we give people a family tree to fill in. Oh, my uncle was an addict. Oh, my aunt was reclusive. She never talked to anybody. Oh, gee, so-and-so had autism. So we look at our family genes. But I have come to the conclusion that we have universal evolutionary genes of hypervigilance, hypersensitivity that are in us and come out when we're stressed and can be called by different names and be given the names of different disorders. But we don't pay any attention to it. So I think that we have to look at genes from a family and this episystemic evolutionary genes and how do they fit in. I think we need to teach people how to connect, how to listen. We have to take these devices away from children. There are many, many laws trying to get into the American schools to ban cell phones from kids. I see kids 1 and 2 years old with the screens looking at stuff, and it's moving too fast. They can't possibly take it all in. And if you're looking at a screen where everything's going like this and the colors are moving back and forth, it's like a psychedelic experience. And you're two, how do you then read an ABC book? It's boring and it won't hold your attention. So I think that what I'm asking for is that we stop with the list of symptoms, stop labeling everybody with a different disorder, and look at when you're hypervigilant, your behavior makes perfect sense if you feel you're in danger. And instead of judging them, criticizing them, blaming them, and treating them like misfits, we have to talk and find out what was it that made you feel threatened, and to communicate with each other and to accept behavior by understanding it, by understanding the neurobiology of behavior. I have great resistance in America because I teach families neuroscience. I show them slides from the top people and I explain it to them as if I were explaining it to you. And guess what? They understand it. And as soon as they understand what's going on, they are motivated to change. And I think that the family has been maligned by the psychiatry field, by the psychology field, because when they don't know what's going on, what do? They blame it on the mother. And the connection between the mother and the child is the strongest connection of any connection in human biology. We need to restore the family and family connections and bring people together rather than separating them. I think we have a 35% rate of estrangement in families with borderline personality disorder. That is unacceptable. And I hope that we can all work towards connecting people in a better way. Thank you.